Dr. Jim Lowe is well recognized both in the university world as well as in the pork industry. Dr. Jim Lowe is an associate dean and professor in the Illinois College of Veterinary Medicine, and he leads the Veterinary Innovation Hub. He's going to be sharing today some vision and insights on land-grant universities and how they are key to animal tech success. So let's welcome Dr. Lowe to the podium.
As we start today, I'm up here as a faculty member, but first and foremost, I'm a pig farmer. And that's really my background and what I think about. And so what I really want to talk about today and we walk through is how do we think about tech and why have we not put tech into operations? What are the barriers? And then how might we unlock some of that? And so that's our really grip today, is how do we think about that? I will tell you, it is not a shiny picture. I don't know how many of you have owned a commodity business, particularly a commodity business in ag. The previous speaker alluded to the fact that hog farms lose a lot of money part of the time. That's a real deal. It's like a real thing. Everybody asks if I'm willing to go to Vegas and gamble. I'm like, no, I raise hogs. I don't need to. Get up every morning and put that big bet on the table, and those are big dollars that roll in and out with often very small margins. We want to talk through some of that and where some of those barriers are. So how did I get here? And I think it's this idea of what has happened in the industry, and I'm going to adjust some things here because this is really fuzzy. So how do we think about where we're at? So I'm a mid-90s graduate, so I've really ridden this wave of consolidation in the livestock industries, particularly in the pork industry. So when we started, I was in private practice, I was James Harriet, I was doing all the things for all the people, including working on horses, which was probably definitely malpractice, but we let it happen anyway. But we had a lot of clients, and our run-of-the-mill client was between 100 and 400 sows, and they crop farmed 1,200 acres. That region in the state of Illinois today that practice doesn't have a pig farm in it. As we've gone from many, many small farms to really large industrial pork manufacturing businesses. And so there's been a lot of lessons that have come along the way, and what do we think about that? So what have I learned over the years? One, there's a better way to work for pork producers, and we have to not be stuck in our box. When we get stuck in a box, we get in trouble. So I was really fortunate, a guy named Ralph Vinson, who's the first guy who figured out how do we not be a veterinarian, how do we be a consultant? And I work for a guy and I'm a business partner with today to a guy named Joe Connor, who's been in Carthage, who said, how do we think about the business of pork production differently? And those are really instrumental in shaping me. I've had the good fortune with Greg Bevere, who's an alumni of this institution and has been all over the globe really doing the pork thing, the pork business. He's currently the COO of Sexing Technologies. And he and a guy named Sir Gordon Hewitt, was at Michigan as a Scotsman, said, listen, Lowe, this has been done before. There are business examples. How do we go replicate that in ag? And then a couple of guys have taught me to think about we don't do process for the sake of process. And if you know anything about modern manufacturing and pork production today, we love the word protocol. And then we have this other thing called a technician, which I would have called a pig farmer. But we now call them a technician. It's like I took my truck in to be worked on, and they didn't have a mechanic, it had the technician work on it. We plugged it in and said, I don't know, the air filter's dirty. In fact, the air filter's wet. Put a new air filter in it. He thought it was solved. I'm like, no, why is the air filter wet? Air filters don't get wet, folks. What's the problem? So we've dumbed this process down by the idea of process, the business down to process. It's probably not where we're at. And then you have to keep people around you, right? I got taught a long time ago, never be the smartest guy at the table. If you're the smartest guy at the table, you don't need a table, folks, because you're not getting anything. You need to put people at that table with you that are smarter in different ways and to bring that to the table. And I'm really fortunate. I got a couple of really good mental sparring partners to hang on with. So here's our fundamental supposition. I will tell you, sitting at the ASV meeting over the weekend and sitting in conversations with customers, the idea that we're going to use robots to replace people in pig barns is a fool's errand. Our belief is it takes people to raise livestock, and it takes people in the barn to raise livestock. That's a non-negotiable. There are societal expectations around that. We have said that caring for pigs, our national institution has said, right, we care. That's the pork board tagline. Caring is an emotion. It takes people to have an emotion. So we have to have people. The question is, how do we help those people, not replace those people? We also believe that business is just a bunch of decisions. It's about making decisions, and those decisions are just a choice between a couple of alternatives often. Many times when we're in livestock production or we're in crop production or everything else, all those decisions become subjective because we don't have complete information about the choices. Therefore, we have to have people to fill the blanks in. Now, unfortunately, with subjective decisions, the error rate's pretty high because we don't know. They're uninformed. And so how do we shift, and we think the opportunity is, how do we shift subjective decision-making to objective decision-making by the person in the building? The person touching the livestock. We're involved in the cattle business today as well, the feedlot side. It's the same exact problem there. How do we shift that decision-making to objective decision-making in the building? And how do we do that in real time, and where does tech fit with that? So we think the actual problem is measurement. And how do we measure, and how do we measure better, and how do we measure faster? So a little history lesson, a little economics. I'm a fan of economics, and I've always been fascinated by the idea. So if we think about what's happened, we've really kind of gone through these 4 giant industrial revolutions. So the first one was about replacing muscle with power. We use steam to replace either horsepower, literal horsepower, or human power to do those jobs. That was enabling. Once we had that, we can now organize those processes in a way that allowed us to be more efficient. Think Henry Ford. We now created the assembly line. The assembly line now enabled the idea that digitization was valuable. Now I can use electrons to replace thinking. I can use electrons to replace measurement. And that digitization was only possible because we'd organized things in a way that was systematic. Once we got things digitized, we can now move to the 4th industrial revolution and say, okay, what are we doing? We can now, again, improve process and change how we make decisions. I've organized it in this table this way because I think it's really useful. There's an underlying technological advance that shifts how we think about business. First power, second electrons, that allows us to reform how we think about managing the business, the decisions within that business. And so that changes the skills we need, right? Originally, the things that were valued before we had power was knowledge and a skill set. I was a craft worker. I was a skilled craftsman. That was valuable. As I moved to the Industrial Revolution, it was about location and work ethic. See the greatest generation. I had to be near the factory, and if I worked hard, I could get ahead. As we moved to the digital piece, it was about what can I do with connections and connectivity and commonality. Who do I know and who can I talk to? How do I grease the skids of business, see the advance of finance? Right? What do we have to do today? The skills that we think are necessary in the future and has big implications on what we think about from a training standpoint is, how do we lead people, how do we gather information, and how do we use reasoning? This is a really different skill set and says who's going to survive or change or move forward. So what happened to the pig business? What happened to livestock industries? Dairy is not any different. I don't know anything about dairy cows except I'm a flu researcher. And all of a sudden last year I got to learn a lot about dairy cows because we do flu and there's no dairy guys that do flu, and pig guys all that get sucked into the dairy business. They might be behind us, if that's possible. I thought nobody was behind. It might be true. So what happened? We got stuck, folks, and we are stuck in the second industrial revolution. We have built manufacturing systems that are based upon organization in standardized process with very, very little electronic measurement. If we're trying to jump to AI, we've missed a step. This is not General Motors manufacturing. We're back at Henry Ford slapping out Model Ts. This is a key piece as we start to think about what we're doing. This is a great book I read. I got this guy's the president of Northeastern University. It says, how do we robot-proof higher education? You can cross out the word higher education and take any industry. This is about what skills and talents and things do we need to be successful in this new digital era. And it's a short read and it's a really good read. So have we seen this before and what's happened? And you know, I'm a history guy and I like history. But if we go look at what happened to Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, the big three in the 70s, they were all out. The famous story of General Motors is they were making green cars. You've not heard this. They were cranking out green cars because they got one market signal that green cars were a hot seller. They were only a hot seller because they discounted them the year before. So they took that bit of information and made a whole lot more green cars, which they had to turn around and discount. They got this awful market signal going, but then on top of that, they had real quality issues. They had real lead delivery time issues, and they were really high cost. They were making things without understanding what the market was. See pig production. I'm breeding a sow today, and I just breed her. I don't even think about what's the potential price because I'm a cost-focused guy, and I'm just going to breed the sow. I'm making a product without understanding what the market is. So what happened? Toyota came in. And Toyota came in and said, wait a minute, there's a better way to do this. We're going to eliminate waste by minimizing errors. We're going to shorten our lead time on production, even though we had to ship them over the ocean. And we're going to listen to the customer and what the customer wants. Gas was expensive. We're going to sell little cars. Toyota's the largest manufacturer of automobiles in the world today, right? Highest in quality, lowest in manufacturing cost. The industry was disrupted because somebody else came in and said that. I put a tagline at the bottom here that says, the other white meat might be our version of the green car. Pig meeting over the weekend. We're sitting here with a major producer who happens to own packing. They said, well, here's our problem, Jim. We're not as high quality as beef, and we can't compete with cost with chicken. I said, I call that the Gulf of Death. You're screwed. I got a product that I can't charge a premium for, and I'm not the low-cost provider in the market. There's only two spots to be in the in the market, either premium or cost in the food business. And we're neither one of those today. And so how do we break this and how do we work our way through that? So where have universities played a role in this? And this is my favorite slide. It is a brilliant story of how land grants have helped shape agriculture. So on this timeline, I put 3 key events in crop production. So what you'll notice in the chart, that's average corn yields as reported by USDA per year. That's the infamous trend line. Corn yields we talk about. It only goes through 2016. That's actually flattened out a little bit the last few years as we've maybe hit some potentials, either with genetics or farming practices or whatever. But what you'll notice is way back in 1837, Mr. Deere invented the steel moldboard plow. That plow allowed us to break the prairies and farm the most productive land in the world. Combination of organic matter and rain and temperature. Without that, we don't have modern U.S. agriculture. That was the one piece. What you'll notice is that there's no impact on yield because all that allowed us to do was to farm. Come along the 1920s, we get broad adoption of the tractor, internal combustion engine. That allows us to farm more than 40 acres. We can now farm at scale. It was a scaling technology. When we got to scale, now all of a sudden, we'd known about hybrid corn for a long time. Hybrid corn had value because I could now farm enough acres to justify the investment in the additional technology. So I have these 2 pieces, one enabling, one scaling, that allowed us to unlock productivity. And what you'll notice is there's this big slope on the line. What you will not notice is an additional change in that line. We talk a lot about ag tech on the crop side, and it's had no change in our efficiency. It's allowed us to farm more because I can drive faster and wider. Auto steer has been a brilliant thing. I can farm more acres because I can drive faster, I can drive a tractor that's wider, I can do it for more hours in the day, but it hasn't changed the net efficiency of the basic unit of production I have, which is an acre of dirt and the sunshine associated with that. So it's been a scaling technology again, but not an efficiency technology. So what's that meant to the economics? So in 1990, the average returns per acre were about, in 2025 dollars, about $450 an acre. We had a return to operations and land of about $450 an acre. Today, we're about $370 an acre if you look at average data out of USDA, or out of our group here at FarmDoc, right? So although we have scaled, we have reduced the return on that basic unit of land. At the same time, land prices have gone from about $750 an acre in current dollars to $16,400 an acre in current dollars. So what does all that net out to be? We had a 60% return on net investment. It's gone to 2.5% return on net investment. I could give you exactly the same kinds of numbers for pigs. That window's a little shorter, and I'll show you the window. They're harder to get our hands on because the cost numbers aren't as transparent as we have with crop production. So I use this as an illustrative junction. So one of the challenges we have is, as we've brought technology to the fold, is it actually benefiting the people making the underlying strategic investment? Is it benefiting operations? And is it doing that in a way that increases profitability? So what's the pig business look like? Well, we have 3 different enabling technologies that allowed us to get to the same spot. The first one of those was this institution right here when we figured out how to use soybean meal to feed pigs. That was an enabling technology to allow us to scale the pig barn, but more importantly, put pigs inside buildings and not having to be outside where we're feeding alternative sources of protein, primarily meat and bone meal. The second one was the invention of confinement barns, which were done across the Midwest, including at this institution by Dick Carlisle, going around the state and saying, how do we work with producers to build barns and build those in a way that's efficient? 4 of those were built, 3 of those are still in use today. Probably shouldn't have been in use in 1965, and they were built in 57, but by God, we're still using them today because we're low cost. Okay? And then the final one, and this was the scaling unlock. So we did it a bit differently. We had 2 technologies, and then we put a scaling unlock in there, which was contract production, and that was really Wendell Murphy in the 1970s. And he said, I'm going to go hire other people to raise my pigs. I'm going to own the pigs, and I'm going to hire someone else to raise those pigs. Which allowed us to do 2 things. One, it allowed us to borrow a lot of money off balance sheet, so I didn't have to have as much capital, and this is a capital-intensive business. Number 2, it spread the poop out. And that became a major issue because the concentration of manure with phosphorus and nitrogen is a real issue. I have to get that distributed, so I can't put that many pigs in a spot. Now I can spread the poop out and capture that back in the system. So as we think about that, right, these institutions on parallel growth, how do we do that? How do we move that forward? And how do we make that happen? So as we believe, and we're going to make this transition, we believe that the goal of the business is to make money now and in the future. We think that's an underlying principle of business decision making. We believe that that success requires action. And that actions require decisions, and decisions require choosing between a couple of options, and those choices require information. And so if we're going to advance and take the next step in tech, how do we create information that's useful by making it transparent, timely, relevant, and accurate? Here's a story for you. Ben Blair, who you can hear from this afternoon during his PhD, pulled a whole bunch of production records from some really well-respected production companies. Individual sow records, so the record of when the sow was bred, when she farrowed. And we're using that to do some AI modeling. Well, I was just cheering him on. Good advisor, just cheer a lot. 30% of those records are wrong, folks. 30% of the individual records were not plausible. They fell out in the filtration. We have an accuracy problem. We couldn't operationalize that data because it took it over a week to get in the system. I'm trying to make live, actionable decisions, and I'm a week late. It's locked up in a central office in a report, not in the hands of somebody on the farm. And it wasn't presented in a format, it's presented in averages. It's not presented in a format about how am I going to act on that. Here's a dirty secret about the pig business. There's only one time we make money in the pig business. That's when I breed a sow. It's the only moment that we make money. That's the creation of new product. Every moment after that is value destruction. Value is declining. Pigs die, they don't grow at the optimal rate, we don't achieve genetic potential. There's a value destruction curve after that. I don't have the information in the hands of the person creating value in my business that's accurate, timely, relevant, or transparent. Those are opportunities, and a guy named Matthew Rudu, who's been in Iowa, is working on that. It's not where it needs to be. As a swine tech's a company, product's called Pig Flow. That's the problem he's trying to solve specifically for the breeding piece. But how do we think in those? Sometimes what we got to do is pretty dumb, right? I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way, but sometimes we're not building rocket ships. Sometimes we've got to go figure out how do we execute on the nuts and bolts. So if we have solvable, why have we not done it? And I'm arguing that we've let a lot of solvable problems impede our success. So what are the barriers? And we've touched on this. One of those is economic. The business is wildly crazy. Huge amounts of profit, huge amounts of loss. You just hope the average is okay, right? It takes a lot of working capital. We certainly have significant infrastructure challenges. We have not, until recently, been able to get internet at all the sites. We raise a lot of pigs in a lot of spots that don't necessarily have connectivity. That's been a problem. It's solved today, but maybe not. 2, we have a workforce that is not digital savvy. Not even kind of digital savvy. The people in the barn are more digital savvy than middle and upper management. That's a problem. They don't think that way. They don't adapt that quickly. And then we got some real practical implementation issues. I'm really fortunate. I see a lot of stuff, a lot of cool tech come across my desk. People sit down, they show it to me, and I look at it, and I go, well, that work in a third world country. And they go, well, it doesn't have to. It's working in a pig barn. No. You prove it to me it'll work in a third world country, and it might work in a hog barn. Right? These are rough, wet, noxious gas environments. And so how do we solve that engineering piece? We have to put that together. Now, I think that's led to some serious management challenges, and this is where we're trying to focus today. What are the fundamental measurement? We have a fundamental measurement mismatch. We're not measuring things that drive system profitability. We're not things that drive pounds or margin over feed. That's what the margin over feed is the metric we have to think about. Therefore, we now have causation and attribution problems. We don't assign the right cause to the actual problems we're seeing. And then we have a really mental model. Ag, if you've not figured that out, if you're a tech person or an academic and you've not been in ag very long, we're kind of conservative. And we're real stuck on this is how we do it. Like real stuck on that. And so how do we find those that are going, there's a better way, and how do we get around the hump? And so the other thing I think we've done that has been a barrier, now I'm going to talk about some positive, but we got to talk about the problems first. We have built a measurement system that maximizes suboptimization. We build a measurement system that maximizes suboptimization, not profitability of the business. We have a measurement system that measures the sow business. We have a measurement system that measures the cow-calf business. We have a measurement system that measures the dairy herd, the cow herd. We have a separate measurement system that measures the growing pig population or the feedlot operation or the growing calves coming out of the dairy. And those two pieces are not integrated. So we've set bonus and incentive structures around how do we make each of those parts run faster, but not in synchrony. I did a quick poll this weekend. I asked the pork producers who were at the rim, because a lot of the vets are working for pork producers. I said, okay, what's the percent of space that's not being utilized today? How many open spaces do you have? No one could tell me. They could guess, but they couldn't tell me. How many pigs do you have on feed? Couldn't tell me that. Third question, which I knew they couldn't answer, but I'd ask it anyway, how many pounds are you going to sell next month? We think about the economic drivers of the business. Those are the three. Now, there's a big channel to get to those three, but those are the three macrometric numbers that we have to understand as a business. We don't have measurement systems in place to tell us those numbers. Space utilization is extremely important. I've never seen a pig gain weight that wasn't standing around eating. If that space doesn't have a pig in it, there's weight is not being gained in it. Space utilization is a key driver of efficiency. Got that beat into my head a long time ago. Inventory becomes important because it tells me what's my potential future sales. Pounds out in the next month tells me what's my marketing strategy, and I really work my way through that. We spend a lot of time in ag tech because of the domination of veterinarians saying, can we find a sick pig? I'm a veterinarian. I don't care. Until we solve how many pigs are on feed, what's our space utilization, and how do I solve the space utilization problem, as a pig farmer, it doesn't matter. I can't change the number of dead pigs enough to materially drive a difference in throughput. We have to solve the throughput problem. And that is the problem that has to be solved. That's where the money's at. Until we get to that, none of the tech's going to be adopted. Throughput, margin over feed. And that key driver in understanding that, so that's flow and availability, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we get there? So we've started this conversation with some producers, and it's been immensely enlightening and immensely frustrating, all in the same conversation. So we think there's plus or minus a 4-step path. The first one of those is we have to decide what decisions are important, i.e. which of those decisions are going to impact throughput the most. So how do we identify those, and how do we get that done? Secondly, we then have to go decide what information do we need to gather. Do we have it? Do we need to measure it? How do we get it there? How do we get the measurement done to allow us to make those decisions in a timely manner? And then the easy stuff starts. How do we integrate the stuff? How do we analyze it? And how do we report it back to the users in a way that they can make decisions with it? So the back end of this is where producers get stuck, because they're like, we don't know anything about this. I don't know anything about how to integrate data and do reporting, and we're not tech people, and that's true. That's a fact. But there's a lot of people that know how to do that. We have to get our own house in order about how do we think about what are those decisions, what do we need to make, and then what information do we need to make those decisions. And it's enlightening because you see the light bulb go off in their head, and it's immensely frustrating because they get frustrated because they can't get to the bottom of it quickly enough. And so it's a changing the mental management model that becomes really, really important as we get our way through this. So what have we done? So we said, okay, we got to figure this out. We need a model. And convincing my partners we should do this in my pig farms was not one of the choices on the table because it was too much money. So what do we have control of? Well, we've got a process here at the university that we can manipulate. We can improve. Manipulate's a dirty word. Manipulate really means we're improving it, right? And so we said, let's go look at the university, because at the university we don't even measure enough to manage sub-optimization, right? We're not into measurement. That's not one of the things that we do as academics. So what do we do? So we put this thing called the Veterinary Innovation Hub together. This was funded by campus, and our dean, Peter Constable, has been really supportive. And so we've pulled together a set of resources to try to, how do we digitize animal care? And we're saying that very loosely. And so if you look at the partners in this, we've been able to work with Geese and we've been able to work with the iSchool to bring in some really, really talented students who we don't have access to every day and say, okay, you have technical knowledge. How do we help shape that technical knowledge in a way around domain knowledge? And then we've brought Geese in to help us because they've got a really talented set of people and students to help us think about how do we do entrepreneurial pieces and how do we do startup and how do we help bring these ideas forward. And then we've said here, Dr. Blair and I have sat here and said, okay, our job is to do Indian understanding of biological significance. So how do we think about the business of pig farming and how do we think about the biology of pig farming? Because those have to be linked together in a way that makes it useful. So we started in our own shop. We said, if we're going to go tell people this, we should start in our own shop and figure out how we do this. And I would argue that a system is a system, and so the university is not different than a pig farm. At the university, we have learning objectives. In swine production, we have production targets. What are we supposed to achieve? We have class, which is where we get our work done. And we have a pig barn, where we get our work done. We have a syllabus, which is what we says we're going to do. And we have a protocol, which is what we said we were going to do. And we have exams versus a closeout. They're parallel pieces. There's ways we assess, plan, and do work that are parallel between most organizations. And so we said, how do we make that happen and how do we move that forward? So Dr. Blair has really led a process, and he's going to explain more about that this afternoon, to say, how do we build some infrastructure to create some tools to unlock a new way to teach? It's the same process of saying, how do we build an infrastructure and then a set of tools to unlock a new way to manage? Managing and teaching are not really different. I spent the vast majority of my career managing businesses. Walking in a classroom is not different than that. Set goals, provide people resources. I communicate to students very early that it's not my job to learn, it's their job to learn. They're the workers here. I'm not in charge of the learning, I'm in charge of the leading. Their job is to do the learning, and then we measure how successful they were at their job by giving them an exam or some form of an assessment. It's exactly what we do in business. So it's not that different. We think it's a complete parallel. So what's the infrastructure we've created? So we have created an infrastructure that allows us to measure work at the level that it's getting done, i.e. at the level of the individual student. And that's pretty easy because we have exams, right? We have individual exams. We don't take group exams. But we're using that, and we're gathering that information electronically. In the College of Veterinary Medicine, all of our exams are given digitally, so that information is easy to capture. We have created a real-time, low-cost, no-work, remember I'm working with faculty, I can't ask them to do extra work, data capture system. We've leveraged our existing systems to do that. We digitize all of our lecture notes, and they're all put in a common system. We'd already done that. We digitize all of our lectures because they're all recorded, partially for study reasons and partially for ADA compliance for our students. So there's transcripts created. We have all of our lecture notes or all of our learning objectives digitized because that's required for our accreditor. And we have all our exam questions and exam results digitized. On top of that, we've gone back and gleaned all the relevant literature from the library and shoved that into the database. And we've grabbed all of our hospital records, which is our primary teaching laboratory during the 4th year. So we have an outcome assessment, not of just the case, but what's the student done in the case, because they actually contribute to those records heavily. So we've got all of that digitized in one space. That allows us to connect all of these dots electronically. So from day 1 anatomy to day 4 walking out the door, how is what we taught them in anatomy, how well did that work as they're reading x-rays as a 4th year and contributing that in the notes, and where are the weaknesses? Now we've created this piece, and then Ben's team is working on some stuff to do some new cutting-edge AI tools from a teaching standpoint. They're not cutting edge from an AI standpoint, but the application of that to education is where we're headed. So what does that allow us to do? One, it allows us to do individual mentoring for students. And that's a big deal. So now we can give an AI tool, think a chatbot, that's cultivated to their needs at their point in the curriculum and say, how do you study? How do we help you study better? That's curated for their material. We've created, and oh, by the way, we can hoover up all that information on the backside and say, what questions are they asking and what were we not clear about in lecture and what should I buff up the next day? Closing that loop is extremely valuable. 2, we've created a live case tool, and I stole this idea, so I learned from Joe Connor, don't go create new ideas, go steal the best ones. Business schools teach with case studies, right? That's the way that business schools teach. UCLA had created a front end that allows any student, they build the learning objectives into their program. This is what the case is going to be about. The student can go in, put in whatever industry, whatever example they want to put in, and the LLM model generates a case customized to that student. They come to class, they've solved that case, and now as they've solved that case, they're discussing the same learning objectives across different industries, across different time points, across different things to try to create that. We've created the same thing basically for veterinary cases. I want to teach about respiratory disease, and Ben wants to learn about it in pigs, and Sam wants to learn about it in goats, and somebody else wants to learn about it in a cat. Great. The principles are the same. How do we do that? How do we create that level of engagement to do that? This is all bilingual. It allows us to measure the effectiveness of the teaching program, to say, soup to nuts, what are we doing, where do we improve? And then, how do we also long-term improve our care delivery? And that's what we're really interested in for the profession long-term, to say, okay, how do you build an optimal diagnostic algorithm that doesn't optimize revenue, but optimizes outcome with a minimum number of steps? How do we remove errors? It's lean diagnostics. If you've been to the human medical system today, we've created exactly the opposite of lean diagnostics. We've created massive diagnostics because there's profit embedded in that. We do the same thing in veterinary medicine. If I just had a little more information, I'm going to run 6 more tests. We know all those tests do not contribute equally. In fact, we create false positives and that actually skew the process in the wrong way. So how do we long-term start to build an optimized diagnostic algorithm to minimize interventions and minimize costs? The same things will apply for pigs and cattle and everything else. But it's just much easier to do in small animal because of the number of tests and the consistency of the work. So how do we go forward? And I think that's the ticket out of all these pieces, right? I think producers, I said we, and we meaning producers, have to accept there's a better way. The path hasn't be a straight line. And so we've got some selling to do with our production friends, saying you're going to have to change how you think, and it might hurt quite a bit in the middle. And the hurt may not be financial, the hurt may be mental and pride. Maybe aren't quite as smart as what we thought we were, and that's a big deal. We have to get to the focus on measuring what matters. That means we have to know what matters, which means we have to understand the business much more deeply. How do we get through those pieces? And here's the biggest challenge. We have to work out methods and technology to delegate decision-making to the people that make an impact. That means they're in the barn. So how do we build tools that empower the person in the building to make better decisions that drive margin over feed cost? What does that look like? How do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that creates the biggest impact? Go take the big bikes first, right? What's the bottleneck? And I think our biggest challenge is the tech works, guys. We know the tech works. Nobody's bringing us tech that doesn't work. I mean, right, we're not bleeding edge tech here. This is ag. How do we work on pilot projects that work on testing decision making? How do we work on projects that pilot how we manage the business and not just focused on the technology? And unfortunately, I have seen more projects and technology that probably would work go to an unfortunate financial grave because we couldn't work out how the decision-making worked, because none of the things we were doing actually forced a management change. If we're going to apply tech, we have to change how we manage, and that's one of the biggest challenges. I think my wrap-up comment on all this is, it's not about the tech, it's what we do with the tech. How does it change the profitability and decision-making of the business? And how do we get down that path in a way? We think the future's super bright. We think the industry will be tremendously disrupted. I think we're sitting at a precipice about like the mid-90s, where the current players in the industry will not be the players in the industry in 10 years. We've got old, worn-out assets, physical assets. We're going to have to build new buildings. We have customers who are changing their demand. We export 33% of our product in a declining domestic consumption market. Now, you can get up and be mad about that, or you can go, that's turmoil, and so there's tremendous opportunity, and somebody's going to make a killing. And so I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see new entrants or existing entrants significantly pivot, and those are the ones who figure out how to adopt tech and adopt better management practices and really jump the second level of this industrial. We don't go from the second to the third level of industrial revolution. We go 2 to 4. And they just make that whole jump at the same time, and that's where the opportunity is. So it's finding those people, it's working with those people, and then supplying those people with what they need is where the tremendous, I think, opportunities are going to be. So thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
I've got a question I've seen since the 90s. It's hard to delegate to the barns because the guys in the office are usually older and they grew up doing it or they got ownership. And usually the farms, they don't. What are other strategies to get them to understand or listen to the barns better than what you told us already?
I think it is finding its senior leadership or middle leadership having enough confidence to be willing to let go. And most of the organization, I know I know all the pit guys. It's a really little community, right? That's not a big list of our current owners. Because, and that's not a condemnation of them, that's because it's high risk, it's a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money, folks. We go build a new pig farm today, it's $25 to $30 million. Let's go write a check, make it happen. My wife is a city girl. When we build a new farm, and this is several years ago, and I brought the note home and said, we're signing for this as part of it. She goes, how many zeros is that? It's okay, honey, it's fine. If we don't have it, they can't take it, it'll be good. Some of that old joke about, oh, you'll take a check? I thought you wanted money, right? But I think the challenge is finding those leaders in the organizations that are willing to let that go and understand it's better. And I'll give you an example. There's a building company in Indiana called FBI. And the owner of that company is named Ed Baylor. And so why am I telling you about their post-frame construction business? So why am I telling you about a post-frame construction business? The post-frame construction industry is super cost competitive. They all have to build exactly the same building because of the specs and the engineering limitations are there. And anybody and their dog can start a post-frame construction business tomorrow because you can buy stuff at Menards. It's the definition of a commodity industry. Okay, super competitive, not differentiated, blah, blah, blah. So Ed's dad started this business. He's in this with his brothers. He realized this business is not making money. Their margins are shrinking. They have no way to create a competitive advantage. And so Ed says it has to change, brought in a new CEO. The CEO is not in the construction business, walks in the door, and goes, this is the most jacked up business I've ever seen in my life. He's been on the job a week. Tells the owner that. Now, the owner was willing to take that risk because he knew it was broken. Not because he was losing money, but he said, I've got to give this to my kids. This is the retirement I'm giving to my kids, and there's no way this business going to my kids works. I'm giving him something that's a hollow thing. So he was deeply motivated to say, I'm going to change. So that CEO came in, they constructed a new platform to where when they build a building, it's all on a tablet. There's no production supervisor anymore because everything's managed there. As they put a wall up, they click that off on the grid. That pulls inventory out, keeps project tracking. So now somebody's in the office and can see where all 45 crews that are building buildings every day are out on the board. It's a really, really simple process, right? This is like manufacturing 101 at distributed. The hardest part of that whole discussion was that was going along and they weren't making much project because they had 6 production supervisors or whatever they call it. The guys that go out, site supervisors, go out and manage the site crew guys. So the middle management. They'd worked for the company for 30 years. They weren't getting it. They were blocking the process. Ed had to go fire all 6 of those guys because they wouldn't get it. He said, these are my friends. My dad hired these guys. They've worked for us for 30 years, but they refused to get it. And so we had to make that really hard decision. So I think the challenge becomes, if we're going to move forward, is how do we have leaders who are willing to challenge the process and say, this is the way we do it, doesn't have to be the way we do it. And then be willing to blow the whole thing up. Right? I think we fall in the trap sometimes of being friends with our coworkers, and that's great. But that's a really hard spot to put yourself when you have to be transformational if one of those coworkers who isn't willing to transform. And I think that's the story to me with Ed. Of saying, listen, we're not making a different product. We're still in a commodity business. We're still slapping metal on wood. But I'm going to re-engineer the process to create a competitive advantage. So that business has grown since that transition, 10x. Top line revenue is up 10x since that transition. They've expanded into 2 other businesses using the same management techniques. And margins doubled. And so it's that who isn't, we talk a lot in the industry, right? Should we make a different pig? Should we make it pig a different way? Should we? Great, those are all really big questions. That's how do we organize packing? There's a whole bunch of pieces, and right, that's a really complicated thing to work out. But in the short term, how do we re-engineer the manufacturing process we have to take that slop out? The most impressive part to me with the FBI story is not 10x in growth. It's that he doubled margin in a commodity business. Most of the time when you grow a commodity business, having done that in a lot of pig farms, margin goes down, not up. And you make up for that by just volume. I make less per acre, I make less per pig, but I got so many more widgets. I worked with the mash house for a long time. Ken's quote a long time ago was, I don't care if you make $100 a pig on 100 pigs. I'd rather make $10 on a million pigs than you make $100 on 100 pigs. Because at the scale, at the end of the day, he has more money in his pocket. It's about the growth of the enterprise, right? And so it's this, when we think about scaling, we normally think about reducing margin. And Ed's saying, I'm scaling the business and driving margin up by completely re-envisioning manufacturing. And I think that's the leap, that's the barrier.
Hey, Jim, we could wax about the pork industry for quite some time, I think. You know, I've thought a lot about this. You know, we disassemble those animals the same way we have for an awful long time, and trying to understand changing consumer habits, and it is a big challenge. But the point of that, there's tremendous opportunity space in the pork industry, and that can be applied, I think, across the barnyard. So with your expertise and experience, both as a producer and working with producers, do you have like 3 areas of focus where you think maybe there's some low-hanging fruit for some digital tools, either for efficiency's sake or maybe some different types of gains that maybe we could start thinking about from a solution standpoint just to kind of create some momentum?
Yeah, I think get it to 3 is a challenge. Well, I think there's some really low-hanging fruit of saying, how do I predict flow? outflow of the business. So cash flow of the business is what we're really predicting. So it's how many pounds am I going to deliver, and how do I do that over this 11-month long production cycle? And so if that starts with how many pigs I'm going to breed, what's the outcome of that breeding, and right? So there's some really simple things around saying, how do we model up flow to say, I'm going to match flow to need, which is space available in finishing, so that I've got finishing barns full, so that I'm delivering the maximum pounds deliverable on a contract. Now, I probably didn't give you one piece. Most pork producers today, most meaning 98% of all pigs or 99% of all pigs sold in the United States are sold under contract. So before I breed that sow, I know where that pig's gonna get hung on a hook. It's probably priced, not always priced, but it certainly has a delivery destination. So I know what my customer is, and I also have specs around what the weight can be at delivery and how many I can deliver. So I know if I can deliver 100, I probably can't deliver 120. I can deliver 100, typically you can deliver between 110 and 90 in any given week, but over time, I've got to deliver 100. I have to average 100. So if I know that, now how do I maximize that number on the fewest number of spaces? How do I reduce operating expense by maximizing that space? And so if I just look at like a really, really simple thing, like solving that's valuable, like super valuable. If you look at the companies that are super profitable, they've hacked that, but they've done it in probably more expensive ways than should be done. So they're buying pigs or they're selling pigs. So they have excess sow production relative to the number of finishing spaces in contract, and they sell off the extra pigs, which they often do at a loss, or they're out in the market buying pigs to fill that gap, which they're doing at a great expense. So they arbitrage that by trading. That's the feeder cattle business, right? I just trade cattle. It's a trading business, not a production business. And so I think if you look at the units that are really efficient, the opportunity then is, how do I do that with my own sow base to minimize that upfront operating expense and yet drive pounds out? So that's like one, like how many noses and tails. The next spot is that if we think about the distribution of weights, when we take pigs to town, we spend all this time trying to figure out how to weigh pigs off the truck, weigh them, and when we go to town, and it's never going to work. You said it, we can't put a camera in a pig barn. It's just, there's too many of them, it's too hard to do, at least in finishing barns. There's too many of them, it's too hard to do. We only turn the barn twice a year. The capital investment doesn't work, yada, yada, yada. I can go along this way, it's not gonna work. But these pigs, we don't tend to think about distributions, but these pigs grow in a distribution with a big left tail. So they don't grow in an even distribution. The front end tends to be very, very loaded. It's a very steep curve up front. And then because of all the factors that my value destruction comment, there's this big left tail to growth rate in the building. And so A, understanding what's that tail look like, B, projecting that tail, and then 3, mathematically solving how do I optimize the barn space utilization so that that tail minimizes pounds out. I've got a cap on weight, guys. So if it's a 212-pound carcass, if I can't sell over a 212-pound carcass, then so I sell everything above, then at some point I've got to empty the building. So I've got 20% of the pigs left to sell or something, right, when I'm selling at the end. The only thing that determines pounds out of the system really is that last 20%. And so what am I doing to shift that distribution? Our first step is measure that distribution, then understand what's driving that distribution, because that's the pounds opportunity out of the system, even if I have the barns full. So that's kind of big ticket item number 2. And then I think ticket item number 3 is, how do we improve measurement and execution, measurement of the execution, not measurement and measurement of the execution of the process. So we know there's 4 or 5 processes that work, and one of those might be at startup. And so I'm going to take pigs out of the farrowing barn, I'm going to dump them in a finisher, or I'm going to dump them in a nursery. So we'd expect those pigs to be warm, and we expect those pigs to have food, and we expect them to have water. Then we expect them probably to be vaccinated for at least circovirus, because we know that's important. How do we know? And if we get that right, it's all kind of downhill after that. They kind of raise themselves after that. Like if I execute the first 2-3 weeks, like I can, when I tell somebody, you don't have to really pay attention. They just go to market. And so what are we doing to measure? Do we know, right, we have the saying in management I've used for a long time, right? Did we do what we say we were going to do? did we actually do it, or did we just talk about it and put it in a book? And so how do we measure that execution of that process? I think those are the low-hanging ones. I think if you think a step back, the bigger one is, how do we reinvent the facilities we raise pigs in? Because I'm not sure that I can take any customer in the US today and walk them into a modern sow barn with all foreign labor, all on concrete, all artificial light, and convince them that that's how we should be raising pigs. And so I think there's a fundamental rework of what does that system look like. I mean, we're using technology from the 70s, folks. The pig barn, I mean, it's gotten better, but it ain't that much different than it was in 1972, right? The first hog barn I went in. How do we rethink that actual factory we're working in a way that drives both consumer acceptance, but also figures out, we got some problems. I don't know where I saw this. If you go look at Iowa, there's all these hot spots around hog barns now because we've had hogs sitting in the same site for 25 years, pumping poop out, and now I can't get rid of the manure out of that facility anymore agronomically because it's too concentrated. The phosphorus is too high around there. We've not used the phosphorus up. And so how do we think about redistributing production? And is there an angle around how do we do rural community development at the same time to say, how do we create farms that are more closely linked with small communities that put jobs back in those communities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's some really interesting questions around that. The technology app there is how do I standardize and integrate production at a bunch of small sites to provide a supply chain that looks like the big supply chains we have today? How do I go provide Walmart with the product they need? Because I'm assuming that Walmart isn't going away. Maybe they are. I don't know. Maybe they don't become the dominant grocer. But today it says, foreseeable future, that's our supply chain we're selling into, and that's why we got big, right? We didn't get big pig farms, and packers didn't get big because packers just wanted to get big. Their customers got big, so therefore they had to get big to meet customer needs. We did a bunch of stuff with Walmart on the beef side for a while about their supply chain and their prime beef activities they're doing and how that all comes together. And, right, it's all about, hey, it takes this many cattle to fill the distribution center, and it's this, and it takes a half a packing plant, guys, to fill a distribution center for Walmart. Half a packing plant. So it's a massive supply chain feeding into that to make it work. And so how does that fit? And so if we're going to have a different and a distributed model, how do we integrate that chain? How do we take a bunch of little parts and make them come together in a way? And that's a tech problem, so that it can flow still into this existing customer base, because until we radically change, and you can do some customer things, right? I mean, people are selling freezer beef, and we can do small projects, and Kurt Zierb or Washington's got a thriving little business selling local meat in Peoria, and that's great, but it's not scalable. And so how do we think more scaled and more that way to make that happen?